What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actresses decides she's had enough? When the cameras are rolling, the audience is watching, and a simple interview spirals into something nobody saw coming. This is the story of the day Julianne Moore walked off Kelly Clarkson's show, and trust me, you need to hear what actually went down in that studio. But before we get into it, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this one is going to leave you speechless. The energy in the studio that morning felt different from the start. Kelly Clarkson's show had become known for its warm, uplifting interviews, the kind where celebrities felt safe to open up, to laugh, to cry, to share stories that felt genuine. The audience loved it. The guests loved it. It was comfort television at its finest, and Kelly had built her reputation on being the host who could make anyone feel at home. But when Julianne Moore walked onto that stage, something in the air shifted. You could see it in her posture, the way she carried herself to the chair, the subtle tension in her smile as she waved to the audience. She was there to promote her latest film, a passion project she'd been working on for years, something deeply personal that had required her to dig into places most actors never have to go. She'd done a dozen interviews already that week, talking about the craft, the process, the emotional weight of the role. She was tired, yes, but she was also proud. This wasn't just another movie. This was something that mattered. Kelly started the interview the way she always did, with enthusiasm and genuine interest, asking Julianne about the film, about what drew her to the project. Julianne's answers were thoughtful, measured, exactly what you'd expect from someone of her caliber. She talked about the director's vision, about the script that had moved her to tears when she first read it, about the responsibility she felt to honor the real woman her character was based on. The audience was captivated. This was the Julianne Moore they admired, articulate, passionate, completely present. Kelly nodded along, smiling, asking follow-up questions that seemed to flow naturally from Julianne's responses. For the first few minutes, everything seemed perfectly fine. Then Kelly shifted gears. She leaned forward slightly, her expression changing to something more curious, more probing. She asked Julianne about a comment she'd made in a magazine interview from several years ago, something about method acting and whether she believed in completely immersing yourself in a role or maintaining distance. It seemed like a reasonable question, the kind that could lead to an interesting discussion about craft and technique. But there was something in the way Kelly framed it, a slight edge to her tone, that made Julianne pause. She tilted her head slightly, studying Kelly's face, trying to understand where this was going. She answered carefully, explaining that her approach varied depending on the role, that there was no one-size-fits-all method, that she respected actors who worked differently than she did. It was a diplomatic answer, the kind you give when you're not entirely sure what someone is really asking. Kelly didn't let it go. She pressed further, bringing up another actress who had recently criticized method acting in a podcast, suggesting that it was self-indulgent and unnecessary. She asked Julianne if she agreed with that assessment, if she thought some actors used method acting as an excuse for bad behavior on set. The question landed like a stone. Julianne's expression tightened. She took a breath, composing herself, and said that she didn't think it was productive to generalize about any approach to acting, that every artist had to find what worked for them, and that judging others for their process wasn't something she was interested in doing. Her voice was steady, but there was a firmness to it now, a boundary being drawn. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the tension. Kelly smiled, that bright television smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said she was just curious because there had been stories about difficult behavior on sets, about actors who demanded too much, who made things harder for everyone else in the name of their craft. She didn't mention any names, but the implication was clear. She was asking Julianne to comment on rumors, to engage in gossip disguised as professional discourse. Julianne's jaw tightened. She looked directly at Kelly and said, very calmly, that she'd never been interested in those kinds of conversations, that her focus had always been on doing good work and treating people with respect. She said it simply, but there was steel in her voice. The audience applauded, a ripple of support for Julianne's refusal to take the bait, but Kelly didn't seem deterred. She laughed lightly, as if to diffuse the tension, and said she wasn't trying to start anything. She was just having a conversation. Then she pivoted again, this time asking Julianne about aging in Hollywood, about whether she felt pressure to look a certain way, to compete with younger actresses for roles. It was a question Julianne had been asked 1,000 times before, and she'd always handled it with grace, talking about the industry's obsession with youth, about the need for better roles for women over 40, about her choice to age naturally and reject cosmetic procedures. But in this moment, coming on the heels of the previous questions, it felt different. It felt like a setup. Julianne answered anyway, saying that she'd made peace with aging, that she was proud of the work she'd done and the life she'd lived, that she wasn't interested in chasing an impossible standard of eternal youth. She spoke eloquently, as she always did, but you could see the exhaustion creeping into her eyes, the realization that this wasn't going to be the interview she'd prepared for. Kelly nodded along, then asked if Julianne ever worried that younger audiences didn't connect with her the way they used to, if she felt like she was becoming less relevant. The question was brutal in its directness. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath. Julianne sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully neutral. She said, quietly, that relevance was a strange word, that she'd never measured her worth by how many people knew her name or wanted to see her movies, that her goal had always been to do meaningful work, to challenge herself, to grow as an artist. She said it with dignity, but there was hurt underneath, the kind of hurt that comes from being disrespected by someone you expected better from. Kelly seemed oblivious, or maybe she was just committed to whatever direction she'd decided this interview was going to go. She asked Julianne if she'd ever considered retiring, if she'd thought about stepping back and letting the next generation have their moment. It was condescending, reductive, the kind of question you'd never ask a male actor of Julianne's stature. Julianne's expression changed. The careful neutrality cracked. She looked at Kelly with something like disbelief, like she couldn't quite believe this was happening. She said, her voice sharper now, that she hadn't come here to discuss her retirement or to justify her continued existence in the industry, that she'd come to talk about her film, about the work she was proud of, about the story she wanted to share with audiences. She said it clearly, firmly, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The audience erupted in applause again, louder this time, supportive and protective of the woman sitting in that chair being subjected to questions she never should have had to answer. Kelly's smile faltered for just a second. She tried to recover, saying she didn't mean to offend, that she was just asking the questions people were curious about. Julianne cut her off. She said, very calmly but with unmistakable authority, that she didn't believe that these weren't the questions thoughtful audiences wanted answered, that this felt less like an interview and more like an interrogation designed to provoke. The studio went silent. You could hear the hum of the lights, the shuffle of feet from the crew standing just off camera. This was live television, unscripted and unfolding in real time, and nobody knew what was going to happen next. Kelly tried to laugh it off, to steer the conversation back to safer ground. She asked Julianne about her co-stars in the film, about what it was like working with the director. But the damage was done. Julianne answered in short, clipped sentences, her warmth gone, replaced by professional courtesy and nothing more. She was giving Kelly exactly what she needed to fill the airtime, but not an ounce more. The interview limped along for another few minutes, each exchange more awkward than the last. The audience could feel it, the discomfort radiating from the stage. Kelly kept trying to inject energy to make it seem like everything was fine, but it wasn't fine, and everyone knew it. Then Kelly made her final mistake. She brought up Julianne's personal life, asking about her marriage, about how she balanced her career with her family responsibilities, about whether she felt guilty for the time she spent away from home. It was invasive, inappropriate, and completely unnecessary. Julianne froze. She stared at Kelly for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she said, very quietly, that her personal life wasn't part of this conversation, that she'd agreed to come on the show to discuss her work, not to be grilled about choices that were nobody's business but her own. Kelly started to respond, to say something about how audiences connected with celebrities through their personal stories, but Julianne stood up. Just stood up, right there in the middle of the interview. The audience gasped. Kelly's face went pale. The moment Julianne Moore's microphone hit that chair, the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. Kelly sat frozen in her seat, her mouth slightly open, eyes wide with shock. The audience didn't know whether to gasp, to clap, to sit in stunned silence. They did all three in confused waves. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of this unraveling, and Kelly's producers were frantically trying to figure out what to do. This was live television. There was no cutting away, no commercial break queued up and ready to save them. This was happening, and everyone was watching. Kelly finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than usual, uncertain in a way her audience had never heard before. She looked at the camera and said, "Wait, Julianne, please, I think there's been a misunderstanding." But Julianne was already at the edge of the stage, her back to Kelly, her posture rigid with controlled anger. She stopped, just for a moment, and that pause felt like it lasted forever. The audience leaned forward collectively, waiting to see if she would turn around, if there was any possibility of salvaging this disaster. Julianne turned her head slightly, not enough to look at Kelly directly, just enough to be heard clearly. She said, "There's no misunderstanding, Kelly. I know exactly what this was." Kelly stood up from her chair now, taking a few steps toward where Julianne stood. Her voice rose with a mix of desperation and defensiveness. She said, "I was just trying to have a real conversation, trying to ask the kinds of questions that go deeper than the usual promotional stuff. Isn't that what good interviews are supposed to do? Go beneath the surface?" Her tone had shifted from shock to almost pleading, but there was an edge of justification in it too, like she was already preparing her defense for what would inevitably become a media firestorm. The audience murmured, "Divided now." Some people were nodding along with Kelly's words, others were shaking their heads, clearly on Julianne's side. Julianne turned around fully then, and the look on her face was something the audience would remember for years. It wasn't rage, not exactly. It was disappointment mixed with exhaustion, the expression of someone who had expected better and been proven wrong. She walked back toward Kelly, not to her chair, but close enough that they could speak without shouting. She said, "You call that going deeper? Asking me if I'm worried about being relevant? Suggesting I should retire? Questioning whether I feel guilty about my marriage and my family? That's not depth, Kelly. That's cruelty disguised as curiosity." The words were measured, precise, each one landing with weight. Kelly's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. Kelly's hands went up in a defensive gesture, her voice rising in pitch. She said, "I never suggested you should retire. I asked if you'd considered it. There's a difference. And these are conversations women in this industry are having, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. I'm giving you a platform to address these things, to speak your truth." The words sounded rehearsed, like talking points she'd prepared in case things went sideways, and maybe she had. Maybe this whole confrontational approach had been intentional from the start, designed to create a moment that would go viral, that would get people talking. If that was the plan, it was working, but not in the way Kelly had hoped. Julianne laughed, but it was a bitter sound, empty of any real amusement. She said, "My truth? You want to know my truth? My truth is that I've been in this industry for over 30 years. I've worked with some of the greatest directors, actors, and writers of our generation. I've won awards, yes, but more importantly, I've built a body of work I'm proud of. And I came here today, to your show, with enthusiasm and respect, ready to talk about a project that matters deeply to me. A film about a woman's resilience, about finding strength in impossible circumstances. And instead of talking about that, instead of asking me about the craft, the story, the message, you decided to make it about my age, my relevance, my personal life, as if those are the only things worth discussing when you have a woman of a certain age sitting across from you." The audience erupted in applause, loud and sustained. Some people stood up. Kelly looked out at them, her expression hardening. She waited for the applause to die down, her jaw set, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost its pleading quality and taken on something sharper. She said, "I think you're being unfair. I ask tough questions to all my guests. That's my job. If you're uncomfortable with honest conversations, maybe the problem isn't the questions. Maybe it's that you're not used to being challenged anymore." The accusation hung in the air, provocative and pointed. The audience responded with a mix of gasps and a few scattered claps from people who apparently agreed with Kelly's assessment. Julianne's eyes narrowed. She took a step closer to Kelly, her voice dropping lower but somehow carrying more power because of it. She said, "Challenged? You think asking me if I'm still relevant is a challenge? That's not a challenge, Kelly. That's an insult. And you know what the saddest part is? You're a woman in this industry too. You know how hard it is, how much we have to fight to be taken seriously, to be valued for more than our appearance or our age." And yet, here you are, perpetuating the exact same toxic nonsense that's been used to diminish women for decades. You're doing their work for them. The words hit like a slap. Kelly's face went from red to pale, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a response. Kelly finally found her voice again, and this time it shook slightly. She said, "That's not fair. I've spent my entire career lifting women up, celebrating women. You don't get to come on my show and lecture me about feminism. I built this show on positivity and connection. If you can't handle a few difficult questions without falling apart, that says more about you than it does about me." It was a low blow, and everyone in the studio knew it. The implication that Julianne was being overly sensitive, that she was falling apart, was both inaccurate and deliberately hurtful. The audience's energy shifted again, more people now clearly uncomfortable with where Kelly was taking this. Julianne smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She said, "Falling apart? I'm not falling apart, Kelly. I'm walking away. There's a difference. Falling apart would be sitting here and taking this, pretending that what you're doing is acceptable, letting you treat me like I'm past my expiration date for the sake of being polite. Walking away is recognizing that I don't have to subject myself to this, that my time and my dignity are worth more than this interview. And yes, you've built a show on positivity and connection, which makes what you did today even more confusing. What happened to that, Kelly? The one who makes people feel safe and valued? Because that's not who showed up for me today." Kelly's composure cracked further. She said, "Maybe if you hadn't come in here with an attitude from the beginning, things would have gone differently. I could feel your resistance the moment you sat down. You barely smiled. You gave short answers. You acted like you didn't want to be here. So forgive me for trying to break through that wall and have an actual conversation instead of letting you recite prepared talking points about your movie." Her voice was rising now, frustration and defensiveness pouring out. The audience was completely silent, riveted by this collision of two strong personalities, both refusing to back down. Julianne's eyebrows shot up. She said, "I came in here with an attitude? I came in here tired, Kelly. Tired from weeks of press, tired from pouring myself into a role that required everything I had, tired from answering the same questions over and over. But I came in here professionally. I was polite. I answered your questions. And the moment I didn't perform enthusiasm at the exact level you expected, you decided to punish me for it. You decided to make this personal. That's what happened here. Don't rewrite the narrative to make yourself the victim." Her voice was strong, unwavering, and the truth of her words resonated through the studio. Kelly threw her hands up, her voice breaking slightly. She said, "I'm not trying to be the victim, but you're standing here accusing me of things that aren't true, making me out to be some kind of monster in front of my audience, my crew, everyone watching at home. Do you know what this is going to do to me? To my show? To my reputation? All because you couldn't handle a tough interview?" Her words revealed the core of her concern. This wasn't about the questions anymore, if it ever really had been. This was about damage control, about the fallout, about what this moment would cost her professionally. Julianne's expression softened slightly, but not with sympathy. It was more like pity, the kind you feel when someone reveals they've completely missed the point. She said, "Kelly, I'm not doing anything to you. You did this to yourself. You made the choice to ask those questions. You made the choice to ignore the boundaries I tried to set. You made the choice to double down instead of apologizing when you saw you'd crossed a line. And now you're standing here more concerned about your reputation than about the fact that you genuinely hurt someone who came here in good faith. That tells me everything I need to know. This isn't about a tough interview. This is about respect, and you didn't show me any." The two women stood facing each other, the space between them crackling with tension. Kelly's eyes were wet now. Whether from anger or tears, it was impossible to say. Kelly's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight seeming to drain out of her for just a moment before she pulled herself back up. She looked out at the audience, then at her crew standing off to the sides, cameras still rolling, capturing every frame of this disaster. When she turned back to Julianne, her voice had changed again, taking on a quality that was harder to read, somewhere between resignation and one last attempt at justification. She said, "You know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe I pushed too hard. But don't stand there and pretend like you're completely innocent in how this played out. You came in here with walls up, and yeah, I tried to break through them. Maybe I used the wrong tools, but at least I tried. At least I was willing to take a risk to get to something real instead of just going through the motions like every other interview show does." Julianne crossed her arms. her posture defensive but her voice remaining steady. She said, "Taking risk with your own vulnerability is brave, Kelly. Taking risks with someone else's, without their permission, is just reckless." And you keep framing this like I owed you something, like I was obligated to tear down my walls for your show, for your audience, for your version of what makes good television. I don't owe you my pain. I don't owe you my insecurities. I don't owe you access to every private corner of my life just because I agreed to come here and talk about my work. The fact that you think I do is part of the problem. It's this entitled mindset that says women, especially women in the public eye, have to give everything, have to be open books, have to perform emotional labor for everyone else's entertainment. Kelly's face flushed again, her hands gesturing sharply as she spoke. She said, "That's not what I think, and it's not fair for you to put words in my mouth. I respect boundaries, I do. But you're acting like I committed some unforgivable sin by asking you questions that thousands of women in this industry face every single day. Questions about aging, about relevance, about balancing career and family. These aren't attack questions, Julianne. These are real issues. And maybe if you weren't so defensive about them, if you could engage with them honestly instead of treating them like insults, we could have actually had a meaningful conversation about something that matters to a lot of people watching." Julianne let out a long breath, and for the first time since she'd stood up to leave, something close to weariness crossed her face. She said, "Kelly, I've engaged with those questions honestly 1,000 times. I've talked about aging in Hollywood in almost every interview I've done for the past decade. I've discussed the challenges women face in this industry, the double standards, the limited opportunities as we get older. I've been open about my choices, my philosophy, my experiences. So when you ask me those questions today, in the way you asked them, with that particular tone and those specific follow-ups, it wasn't about exploring important issues. It was about creating a moment. It was about pushing me until something broke so you could have your viral clip, your water cooler moment, your proof that your show takes risks. And congratulations, you got it. This will be everywhere by tonight. People will be talking about it for days. But what did you actually accomplish besides making someone feel attacked in what's supposed to be a safe space?" The audience was completely silent now, every eye moving between the two women like spectators at a tennis match, waiting to see who would land the next shot. Kelly's producer, a woman in her 40s with a headset and a clipboard, had moved closer to the stage, clearly torn between wanting to intervene and knowing that anything she did would only make things worse. The crew members who weren't operating cameras stood frozen, uncertain whether they should be documenting this or pretending not to see it. Kelly's voice dropped lower, taking on an almost pleading quality again. She said, "Julianne, I never wanted you to feel attacked. That was never my intention. I genuinely thought we could have a different kind of conversation, something that went beyond the surface-level promotional stuff. And maybe I miscalculated, maybe I misread the situation, but I'm not this terrible person you're making me out to be. I'm just someone who was trying to do something different, trying to push the boundaries of what these interviews can be. If I hurt you in the process, I'm sorry, but you have to understand where I was coming from." Julianne studied Kelly's face for a long moment, searching for something in her expression. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less firm. She said, "I understand where you were coming from, Kelly. I understand that you want your show to stand out, that you want to be seen as more than just another friendly daytime talk show host. I understand ambition. I understand wanting to prove yourself. I understand the pressure to create memorable moments. But here's what you need to understand. Your ambition, your desire to be different, your need to create viral moments, none of that justifies making someone else uncomfortable. None of that gives you permission to cross lines. And saying you're sorry if you hurt me, putting the emphasis on if, that's not really an apology. That's a statement designed to make you feel better while placing the burden of interpretation on me. Either you hurt me or you didn't. There's no if about it." Kelly's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with something between hurt and anger. She said, "Fine, then I'm sorry that I hurt you. Is that better? I'm sorry that asking you legitimate questions about your career and your life hurt your feelings. I'm sorry that trying to have an honest conversation was too much for you to handle. I'm sorry that you walked into my studio with expectations that I apparently failed to meet." Her words dripped with sarcasm. The apology transformed into another accusation. Whatever composure she'd been trying to maintain was crumbling. revealing the defensiveness and wounded pride underneath. Julianne nodded slowly, a sad smile crossing her face. She said, "And there it is. The real Kelly Clarkson, the one who's been hiding behind the friendly facade this whole time. Thank you for finally showing up, because that apology, if we can even call it that, tells me everything I needed to know. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry that I reacted the way I did. You're sorry that this isn't going the way you planned. You're sorry that I'm standing here calling you out instead of sitting quietly in that chair and taking it. But you're not actually sorry for the questions themselves, for the disrespect, for the violation of trust, and that's why I'm leaving. Because there's no conversation to be had with someone who fundamentally doesn't understand what they did wrong." Kelly's voice rose sharply, her composure finally shattering completely. She said, "You know what, Julianne, maybe you're right. Maybe I'm not sorry for asking tough questions. Maybe I'm not sorry for refusing to treat you with kid gloves just because you've had a long career and won some awards. Maybe I'm not sorry for expecting you to be a professional who can handle a challenging interview without throwing a tantrum and storming off like a child. You want to talk about respect? How about the respect you owe to me, to my show, to this audience who came here excited to see you? How about the respect you owe to the professional agreement you made when you agreed to come on this show? But no, the moment things get uncomfortable, the moment someone asks you something you don't like, you shut down and walk away. That's not strength, Julianne. That's weakness." The audience gasped collectively, a wave of shock rippling through the studio. Several people stood up, some looking like they wanted to leave, others looking like they wanted to intervene. Julianne stood perfectly still, her face carefully neutral, and when she spoke, her voice was ice cold. She said, "Calling me weak after everything you've put me through in the last 20 minutes is really something, Kelly. But you know what? I'm not going to engage with that. I'm not going to stand here and defend my strength to someone who's clearly more interested in being right than being decent. I came here today as a professional. I sat in that chair as a professional. And I'm leaving as a professional because professionals know when to walk away from situations that are harmful and unproductive. This is that situation. And for what it's worth, I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, whatever drove you to turn what should have been a simple interview into this mess. I really do. Because nobody should feel this desperate to prove something that they're willing to burn bridges and hurt people in the process." Kelly opened her mouth to respond, but Julianne held up a hand, stopping her. She said, "I'm done, Kelly. Whatever else you have to say, save it for your producers, your publicist, whoever has to help you clean this up. I won't be here to hear it." She turned again, this time with finality, and walked toward the exit. The cameras followed her every step, capturing the straight line of her spine, the measured pace of her walk, the absolute dignity in her refusal to run or rush despite the chaos she was leaving behind. Kelly stood alone on the stage, her face a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite control. She looked at the audience, at the cameras, at her producer, who was frantically making cutting motions with her hand. Kelly's voice came out broken and small when she finally spoke. So there you have it, the day Julianne Moore walked off Kelly Clarkson's show. Not because she couldn't handle tough questions, but because she refused to accept disrespect disguised as journalism. Make sure to subscribe.